Have you ever felt that subtle pull, almost like a whisper from within, urging you forward on your spiritual path? That quiet voice that says, keep going, achieve more, reach higher. Ambition. It seems harmless, even helpful at first. After all, how else would we grow if not by striving, by setting goals, and by pushing ourselves beyond our limits? But what if I told you that ambition, that very force that drives many of us toward awakening, can also become one of the greatest obstacles in our practice? This is a paradox that has challenged practitioners for thousands of years. Ambition in spiritual practice is like an invisible trap, a mirage that promises progress but can easily lead us astray, deep into the thickets of ego, frustration, and suffering. Imagine a traveler on a foggy mountain path. The traveler sets out with the sincere intention to reach the summit, the place of clarity and peace. Along the way, a glowing light appears in the distance, beckoning them forward. The light feels like hope, like a guide. But as the traveler rushes toward it, the light shifts farther away, always just out of reach. Distracted by the chase, the traveler stumbles, loses footing, or forgets to appreciate the journey itself. This is the story of ambition in practice. The Buddha understood this trap well. He taught that craving, tanha in Pali, is the root of suffering. And craving doesn't only mean craving for material things. It includes craving for status, recognition, spiritual achievements, and even the desire to be free from suffering itself. When ambition turns into craving for success on the spiritual path, it binds us tighter to the very suffering we seek to escape. So, how do we recognize when ambition has become a trap? How do we keep the fire of motivation alive without letting it burn us from within? And most importantly, how do we walk the path with an open heart, free from the chains of ego-driven desires? These are the questions we'll explore together. Because here's the truth: true spiritual progress isn't measured by milestones, titles, or comparisons. It's about a shift in how we relate to ourselves and the world. It's about letting go, about presence, about embracing the path exactly as it is, without rushing, grasping, or pushing. In the chapters ahead, we'll dive deep into the nature of ambition, how it arises in the mind, and how it can quietly infiltrate even the most well-meaning practice. We'll explore practical tools rooted in ancient wisdom that help us stay clear and grounded. And we'll share stories of masters who faced these very struggles and found their way through with grace and humility. But for now, take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Where have you felt the tug of ambition? Has it ever distracted you from the simple act of being present? Maybe even created a subtle dissatisfaction with where you are? If so, you're not alone. This subtle tension between wanting and being is one of the great challenges of the spiritual path. Yet it's also one of its most profound invitations, to awaken not just to enlightenment as a distant goal, but to awaken here and now, in the midst of our imperfect, unfolding lives. So let's begin this journey together, mindful, open, and ready to see ambition not as an enemy, but as a signpost pointing us deeper into understanding. Because the path to awakening is not a race. It's ambition. It's a word we often hear, sometimes even celebrate. Society encourages us to be ambitious, to set goals, to chase success, to push beyond what seems possible. But when we step onto a spiritual path, the meaning of ambition takes on new shades, subtler and more complex. At its heart, ambition is a kind of energy. It's the inner fire that propels us forward, that ignites our desire for growth and transformation. Without ambition, many of us might never begin a practice, never seek a deeper understanding of ourselves or the world. So, ambition is not inherently wrong. In fact, it's essential. Yet, as with any powerful force, ambition has a shadow side. In Buddhist teachings, we talk about tanha, often translated as craving or thirst. This craving is not just for food, comfort, or possessions, but also for intangible things: recognition, progress, and even spiritual accomplishments. Ambition can easily cross the line from being a motivating spark into becoming a form of craving that traps us, But why does this happen? Why does something as seemingly positive as ambition turn into a source of suffering? To answer this, we need to look at where ambition arises from. Deep down, ambition is often rooted in what we might call a sense of lack, a feeling that we are somehow incomplete or not enough as we are. This feeling triggers a desire to become more, to prove ourselves, or to escape from uncomfortable realities within. It's the mind's way of trying to fill a void, to find validation and security. This is where ambition becomes complicated on the spiritual path. When ambition is driven by ego, the part of ourselves that identifies with status, achievement, and comparison, it no longer serves freedom. Instead, it creates a cycle of attachment. We chase after ideals, we judge our progress, and we measure our worth against others. The path turns from a place of liberation into a battlefield of striving. The Buddha called this the knot of craving, a tight grip that blinds us to the present moment and the truth of our own nature. On the other hand, there is a more wholesome form of ambition, one that arises from genuine inspiration, compassion, and a heartfelt wish to awaken and help others. This is not about self-centered gain, but about a deep commitment to growth without grasping. It's ambition tempered by wisdom and kindness. Recognizing which form of ambition we're caught in is the first step toward freedom. Ask yourself, am I practicing to prove something, to myself or to others? Do I feel restless or dissatisfied with where I am? Do I compare my journey to others, feeling either superior or inferior? Or am I simply devoted to the path with openness, patience, and joy, no matter the pace? These questions are not about judgment. They are invitations to look clearly at the mind's motivations. Because understanding ambition, its nature and roots, opens the door to transforming it. From a source of tension and suffering, ambition can become a gentle guide, reminding us to return to what really matters: presence, humility, and sincere intention. This insight will be our foundation as we move forward. Next, we'll explore how ambition disguises itself as spiritual pride, the subtle ways the ego tries to claim ownership of our progress, often without us even noticing. It's a delicate dance, and becoming aware is key. But before we step into that, take a moment to breathe. Reflect on your own experience with ambition. Notice how it feels, not just in your thoughts, but deep in your body and heart. Ambition is powerful, but with awareness it can be wise. As we deepen our journey, one of the most subtle and tricky challenges emerges: the ego. Not the loud, obvious kind you might expect, but a quiet, persistent presence that colors our motives and actions without us always realizing it. When ambition crosses into ego-driven territory, it stops being a source of inspiration and instead becomes a source of inner conflict. So how do we spot these ego-driven motives in our practice? How do we recognize when the ego is quietly steering the ship? First, let's understand what this spiritual ego looks like. It's that inner voice that craves recognition, not just from others, but also from ourselves. It whispers, "Look how far you've come," or "You're better than those who struggle." It fuels comparisons, envy, and pride, often disguised as humble confidence. You might find yourself thinking, "I'm more disciplined," or "My meditation is deeper." These thoughts might feel natural, even encouraging, but they're signs that the ego is building walls between you and genuine openness. This ego-driven ambition often manifests in a need for validation. Maybe you want praise for your spiritual progress or feel a silent competition with fellow practitioners. The desire to be seen as advanced or enlightened can creep in, subtly twisting your intention. And here's the catch: because this ego is so intertwined with our identity, it's often the last thing we want to admit or confront. It masks itself as motivation, making it hard to tell where healthy aspiration ends and ego-driven craving begins. But why is this a problem? Because ego-driven motives create a barrier to true transformation. When your practice is about feeding the ego, you're still caught in the cycle of self-centeredness. You might gain temporary satisfaction or status, but the deeper freedom and peace remain elusive. Recognizing this dynamic requires honest self-reflection. Ask yourself, am I practicing to genuinely awaken or to prove something? Do I feel a sense of superiority or competition with others on the path? When I meditate or engage in spiritual practices, is my mind calm and open, or am I chasing a feeling of accomplishment? Do I catch myself comparing my progress with others, feeling proud or discouraged? These questions are invitations to look beneath the surface. Another way to catch ego-driven motives is to notice emotional reactions. Do you feel frustration or impatience when things don't go your way? Does criticism or lack of recognition sting more than it should? These emotional spikes often signal where the ego is still active. One powerful practice to counter this is cultivating humility. Not the false humility of self-deprecation, but the genuine understanding that every step on the path is imperfect, fragile, and deeply interconnected with others. Humility softens the ego's grip and opens the heart to true growth. In the stories of many great spiritual teachers, this balance between confidence and humility is key. They embody a strength that does not need to prove itself, a confidence rooted in surrender rather than conquest. As we continue, we'll explore how the Buddha's teaching of the middle way guides us in balancing ambition and detachment. It's a delicate equilibrium, nurturing our growth without clinging, striving without grasping. This balance is the art of walking the path skillfully, but before that, take a moment now to observe your own motives. Notice, in the heart of the Buddha's teachings lies a profound wisdom that gently guides us through the complexities of ambition, the middle way. This is not just a philosophical concept, but a living, breathing path that invites us to walk between extremes, with grace, awareness, and balance. The middle way asks us to hold two seemingly opposing forces at once, the energy of ambition and the peace of detachment. On one side, ambition is the flame that lights our way. It fuels our desire to awaken, to grow, to deepen our understanding. Without this fire, the path may feel dull, stagnant, or directionless. On the other side, detachment is the cool breeze that prevents us from being burned by that very flame. It's the wisdom to hold our aspirations lightly, without clinging, without grasping, without becoming prisoners to outcomes or expectations. But what does it really mean to balance ambition with detachment? Imagine a tightrope walker. Their success depends on steady focus, precise balance, and the ability to adapt to shifts in wind and movement. Too much leaning to one side and they fall. Too rigid and they lose flexibility. The middle way is this delicate art of balance, not just in practice, but in how we relate to ambition itself. In practical terms, balancing ambition with detachment means pursuing your spiritual goals with wholehearted intention, yet without being attached to specific results or timelines. It means showing up consistently, yet releasing the need for recognition or perfection. It means embracing progress, but also accepting setbacks with kindness. This balance is reflected in the Buddha's own journey. Before his enlightenment, he experienced extremes, years of harsh asceticism followed by indulgence, only to discover that neither path led to true freedom. Instead, he chose the middle way, a path that honored both effort and ease. For us, this teaching offers a powerful antidote to the trap of ambition that binds us in frustration and disappointment. Because when ambition is balanced by detachment, it becomes a source of joy rather than suffering. It frees us from the tyranny of more, better, faster, and invites us into a spaciousness where growth unfolds naturally. This is not easy. The mind loves certainty, goals, and measurable progress. Letting go of expectations feels like stepping into the unknown, but in that unknown lies true freedom. One practical way to cultivate this balance is through mindfulness, the gentle practice of bringing awareness to the present moment, observing our thoughts and feelings without judgment. Mindfulness helps us notice when ambition turns to grasping, when motivation slips into craving. It creates space to choose a different response: patience, acceptance, or simply letting go. Another powerful tool is cultivating upekkha, equanimity, a deep inner steadiness that remains unshaken by success or failure, praise or criticism. With equanimity, we can hold ambition tenderly, like a flame protected from harsh winds, neither extinguished nor allowed to rage uncontrolled. And as we cultivate this balance, we begin to see ambition not as an enemy, but as a faithful companion on the path. Walking the spiritual path with ambition is like navigating a river. It can carry us forward with strength, but if we're not careful, hidden currents can pull us into dangerous traps. So how do we steer clear of these pitfalls and keep our ambition healthy and balanced? This chapter offers practical methods, simple yet profound tools, to help you recognize, avoid, and transform ambition traps that can block your progress. First, cultivate clear intention. Before you begin your practice each day, pause and ask yourself, why am I doing this today? Is it to genuinely awaken, to serve others, or simply to check a box or impress someone? Setting a sincere intention grounds your energy and keeps your ambition aligned with your deepest values. When intention is clear, ambition becomes a purposeful force rather than a restless craving. Second, practice mindfulness with self-inquiry. As you move through your practice, bring gentle attention to your thoughts and feelings. Notice when the mind drifts toward comparison, judgment, or impatience. Instead of pushing these feelings away, lean into curiosity. Ask, what is driving this feeling? Is this true motivation or ego at play? This awareness creates a spaciousness that dissolves the power of ambition traps. Third, embrace humility through reflection. Regularly remind yourself that the spiritual path is not a race or competition. Reflect on your own humanity and imperfections. Recall that every teacher, no matter how enlightened, has wrestled with ego and ambition. This recognition softens pride and nurtures compassion for yourself and others. Fourth, develop a support system. Surround yourself with teachers, friends, or sangha, community, that can hold you accountable and offer honest feedback. Sometimes, ego-driven ambition thrives in isolation. A trusted circle helps reflect blind spots and keeps you grounded. Fifth, balance effort with rest. Burnout is a classic ambition trap. Pushing relentlessly without pause only fuels frustration and disillusionment. Honor your body and mind's need for rest. Incorporate periods of relaxation, reflection, and play. This balance replenishes your energy and sustains long-term practice. Sixth, practice generosity and service. Redirect some of your ambition energy outward. Engage in acts of kindness or service without expectation of reward. This shifts focus from self-centered striving to compassionate action, loosening ambition's grip on ego. Seventh, remember impermanence. Everything changes. Our achievements, our struggles, even our deepest insights. Holding this truth in mind softens attachment to specific outcomes. It invites a fluid, open-hearted approach where ambition flows but does not bind. By integrating these methods, ambition becomes a wise ally, energizing your path without entangling you in invisible traps. No path is perfect, and challenges will arise. But these tools offer a compass to navigate ambition's landscape with clarity and grace. In the coming chapter, we will explore how to nurture patience and compassion for ourselves along this journey, because ambition without kindness often leads to harsh self-judgment and burnout. Before we move on, take a moment. Throughout the ages, the spiritual journey has been illuminated by countless masters who walked the path with ambition, but didn't let it consume them. Instead, they transformed ambition from a trap into a catalyst for awakening, embodying wisdom and compassion in every step. Their stories offer us timeless inspiration and practical guidance. They remind us that ambition, when balanced with humility and insight, can lead not to ego's prison, but to true liberation. Take the Buddha himself. Before enlightenment, Siddhartha Gautama was driven by a fierce ambition to understand suffering and find freedom. He left his royal life behind, enduring years of extreme asceticism and deep meditation. But crucially, he recognized the futility of extremes, both harsh self-denial and indulgence, and embraced the middle way. His ambition was not to gain fame or power, but to serve all beings with compassion. Through this shift, ambition became a flame of wisdom rather than a blaze of ego. Another example is the Zen master Dogen, who lived in 13th century Japan. Dogen's ambition to fully realize the truth was immense, yet he taught that enlightenment isn't a distant goal, but is found in the very act of practice itself. His famous teaching, "Practice and realization are not two," invites us to let go of future-oriented striving. Dogen's ambition was surrendered to the present moment, dissolving the ego's grip and revealing the profound simplicity of being. Then there is the story of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen monk whose peaceful determination changed the course of mindfulness practice worldwide. His ambition to heal the wounds of war and suffering was deeply rooted in compassion. Even in exile and hardship, he maintained humility and gentleness, reminding us that ambition can be a quiet, steadfast commitment to love and peace, not a loud proclamation of achievement. Each of these masters faced the very same challenge you face now: how to pursue growth without becoming ensnared by ego. Their secret was not to reject ambition, but to see through it, to understand its roots, refine its energy, and infuse it with compassion. These stories teach us that ambition can be a powerful force for good when it is tempered by wisdom. They invite us to transform our own ambition from a source of suffering into a path of freedom. As you reflect on these lives, consider your own journey. What kind of ambition do you want to nurture? What wisdom will guide you when temptation arises? In our final chapter, we will return. As we arrive at the close of this journey, it's important to remember that walking the spiritual path is not about perfection or conquest. It's about embracing the dance between ambition and surrender, with humility, patience, and joy. Ambition, when held with an open heart and steady mind, becomes a vibrant force that propels us forward without binding us in frustration or pride. It invites us to awaken not through force, but through gentle persistence and deep self-understanding. Walking free from ambition's invisible trap means cultivating humility, not as weakness, but as the strength to acknowledge our limits, to learn from every experience, and to remain open to growth. It means welcoming joy, not as fleeting pleasure, but as a steady light that brightens even the darkest moments of practice. Remember, every step on this path, no matter how small, is a victory. The very act of returning again and again to practice, with awareness and kindness, is itself a profound achievement. So, hold your ambition like a precious flame, nurture it, but don't clutch it tightly. Let it illuminate your way, but don't let it consume your peace. If this journey has resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts, questions, or experiences in the comments below. Your voice enriches this community, and together we can support one another in walking the middle way. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay connected with more teachings that nurture both your heart and mind on this path. Thank you for being here, for your courage to look deeply, and for your commitment to walking with humility and joy. May your practice be gentle, your ambition wise, and your heart free.